really reach bilateral agreement over the drawing of this boundary is to come and so that each side is equally dissatisfied with the result, because there is no way that either side can be totally satisfied. It means the other side is totally dissatisfied. And of course, there have to be compromises which have to be made in this respect. Now, the Israel and the West Bank, oh no, you see I stuck some Middle East maps in, which I no longer need. Israel and the West Bank, you see here a map of the West Bank. This is a map taken off the Foreign Ministry site, the Israel Foreign Ministry site. Actually, this is actually taken from a B'Tselem document, which is a human rights organization, but it's the map from the Foreign Ministry site, which many people use. And this is a map which shows Israel and the West Bank after the Oslo Accords. The first Accords were signed in 1993, and the second Accords in 1995. And I think it'd be very interesting to have a look with you at this map and to together with you talk you through the issue of borders and territory and geopolitics. The first comment to make about this map is to say, well, maybe this is the first postmodern map in history. You know, it's as though someone took a paintbrush, closed their eyes, and they splashed a bit of yellow and a bit of brown and a bit of green. There are all sorts of colors there, and they represent a very complex territorial situation which emerged out of the Second Oslo Agreement, which basically divided the West Bank into three types of area. Areas A, Areas B, and Area C. Areas A were the areas which were transferred to full Palestinian control. They included the majority of the people and all of the major towns, but on a minority of the territory. Remember that most people in the Western world live in urban metropolitan areas which are very dense, but they don't cover large territories and large areas. Areas B included many of the remaining Palestinian villages where the civilian control was transferred to the Palestinians, but Israel maintained for itself the right to have security management if and when they deemed it necessary. And Area C, including the whole of the Jordan Valley, the whole of this area here where you see the light blue, which is Israel's, which was the eastern border between the West Bank and Jordan, remained Area C under full Israeli control. And the idea at Oslo II was there were a number of issues which now had to be discussed over a period of 5 years. One was Jerusalem, one was refugees, one was water, one was, and another one was the issue of the final borders. Both the Israelis and the Palestinians signed on this map at the time, but the Palestinians only signed on the map under the assumption that this was a temporary map. This was by no means a final agreement, and that at the end of 5 years negotiations, which of course never took place at the end of the day, because the peace spoilers on both sides managed to bring down the peace process in the Oslo Accords, the idea was that there would be a compact territory, a contiguous territory, and not this sort of cheese map type territory with holes in the middle, with safety passage roads and safe bypasses, and Areas A going into Areas B. It was just a recipe for disaster, particularly in a situation where, if I can use another British understatement, is to say the two peoples don't particularly have a lot of love for each other. They may have a realistic situation of why some of them believe you have to make an agreement, but unfortunately, given the animosity and the hatred and the violence of the past 50, 60, 70 years, they're not going towards an agreement because each has suddenly come to love the other. It was at the time of Oslo because each suddenly realized that the other isn't going to go away, and that basically the two options facing them in the long-term future was the continuation of violence or the separation of territories in which each would have to make a certain compromise. The line separating the West Bank from Israel has become known as the Green Line. The Green Line because at the time of the Rhodes Armistice Agreements in 1949, after what is known as Israel's War of Independence, what the Palestinians know as the Nakba, and then they went to Rhodes, and there were 5 separate discussions: Israel with Lebanon, Israel with Syria, Israel with Egypt, 4 separate discussions, and Israel with Jordan. Jordan then controlled or administered the West Bank. And under the agreement they came to with Jordan, they drew up this area which we now know as the West Bank. Prior to that period, there had never been a border in the west of Palestine. As we saw in the previous presentation, the division of Palestine between west and east by the British Mandate in 1921-22, that itself was a division of historical Palestine. But west of the river, there'd never been any partition. And the line that was drawn up in 1949 in the Rhodes Armistice Agreements, which basically created a new political entity known as the West Bank, was the line which became the border between the West Bank and Israel, became known as the Green Line. And some of you may laugh, some of you may know the answer, but the reason that was the case was because they used a green pen on the Rhodes Armistice Agreements, and afterwards Israel always used a green marker on all its official maps to depict the line separating it from the West Bank. Interestingly, that the concept of the Green Line became the concept known for borders between ethnically competing areas. So you have it used in Nicosia, in Belfast, in Beirut, but the original Green Line in this sense was the one between Israel and the West Bank. It wasn't a good line at the time. It was even a worse line 20 years later. It didn't reflect any real ethnic distribution of populations, because of course there were Arab-Palestinians throughout Palestine, and because of the way that this line was drawn, some became Arab citizens of Israel and others became stateless Palestinians of the West Bank, cut off from each other for 20 years until 1967, despite the fact that prior to that, for many centuries, this had been a single ethnic area and had never been divided, and the line basically reflected the position of the military troops at the end of the 1948-49 war. But this became the line, and it says something very interesting about borders. Just as the borders that were drawn up after the First World War in Europe say something very interesting. And that is, when you see maps for the first time, when you see borders for the first time, they are the ones which teach you about a region. The Green Line is a very artificial border. Both Palestinians and Israelis will tell you it's a crazy border. There's no logic behind it, apart from the fact that it was a border for 19 years. Well, not for 19 years. It's really been a border since 49 until today. And yet, in most people's imagination, the Green Line is the default border of the region. In other words, if you can't reach a bilateral agreement whereby you redraw the border according to the realities of the day, to the mutual dissatisfaction or satisfaction of both sides, then the argument, particularly on the Palestinian side, is, well, let's go back to the Green Line. Because why? The Green Line existed. And that's a very strong argument, by the way, although it doesn't necessarily have any formal international recognition as such, because it is still an armistice line. It's not a line between two sovereign states. And therefore, it's very powerful in our imagination. Borders don't have to exist for a long time period for them to be imprinted on our cartographic imaginations. And that's the case of many of the borders that were created after the First World War in Central and Eastern Europe and have basically remained with us or returned to us as the major borders which determine the state territories of Europe until today. There is one other border which has become significant in the past 15 years, and that's the security, separation, barrier, wall, fence. I always say delete whichever term you're least comfortable with. They all have certain political emotions about them and sensitivities. But of course, that's a very important border, but it's not a bilateral border. It's a unilaterally imposed border by the stronger side, Israel, on the landscape because of what it perceives as various security and terrorist threats. It therefore decided to go ahead and create a fence, parts of it a wall, but only very small parts a wall, although they are the places which you see more in the media, in order to separate the West Bank from Israel, and which in essence functions as a border and prevents most Palestinians from coming into Israel on a daily basis unless they have work permits as such. Now, that's a very significant border for two reasons. One reason is that it deviates from the Green Line. In the areas where there are many Israeli settlements, and we're not going to get into the discussion here, you can ask the question afterwards, legal, illegal, moral, immoral establishment of settlements in the West Bank. But there are 350,000 Israeli resident settlers of the West Bank today, and that's not including East Jerusalem. Now, that has a powerful impact on the drawing of borders. Even if you argue that all the settlements are illegal and shouldn't have been there in the first place, they are there on the ground. They've changed the geopolitical and geographical realities on the ground. And therefore, they have a very powerful impact on the drawing of borders, because Israel then tries to think, in all of these Track 2 negotiations, how can we draw a border which will keep as many settlements on the Israeli side of the border, therefore will not necessitate future evacuation under a two-state solution, but on as small a piece of territory as possible. And there's been some amazing cartographic ingenuity by people, including many who don't understand maps and don't understand topography, in drawing these borders up. And to a certain extent, the separation barrier pretty much goes along the line of that way of thinking. The way of thinking which says, let's draw a border which keeps the settlements close to the Green Line inside Israel, and we'll have to think later about what happens. Do we therefore annex territory, or do we, as has been a discussion in the past 10, 15 years, do we get involved in exchanging territories? Well, we want 10% of the territory on the West Bank side of the border. If we base a two-state solution on the principle of an equal amount of territory as existed in 1967, do we then have to give up other pieces of empty territory on the Israeli side? And there are a lot of maps looking at that, both on the Israeli and the Palestinian side, and looking at how and where such land exchanges could actually be carried out. That nevertheless still leaves a problem, that even if you can create a border where, let's say, 60% or 65% of the settlements remain inside the Israeli side of the border, and you've exchanged empty land on the other side for a Palestinian state, so you have a completely different border, it still leaves something like 25, 30, 35% of the settlements on the other side, and that's no small number. It's not the Gaza Strip again of 6,000, 7,000 people. It's still 80, 90,000 people in some of the most ideologically focused settlements, and therefore that still leaves a huge problem for Israel particularly to deal with if and when you were to bilaterally go into negotiations again. And the most recent thinking about drawing borders has been the idea, well, it leaves such a problem, even for those of us who believe that there should be a two-state solution, that you do need to separate territories, you do need to draw borders. There are some, and I'm going in that direction very slowly, and I've been in this game for a long time, who say it's no longer possible to draw the border. It has become so complex that we have to think beyond the territorial box. We have to think about two states in terms of power, but not necessarily two states in terms of territory. And most recently, there's been a very major research project which took place at the Hebrew University. I was involved in this project about, can you create two separate power entities, each with their own citizenship, each with their own identity and sovereignty, but in which there is cross-citizenship, where all the Arab Palestinians, wherever they are residing, belong to one of the states, and where the Israeli-Jews belong to the other state. That sounds a bit crazy, it sounds very fictional at the moment, but it's one discourse which is taking place as many people who have worked towards drawing borders between two states find it increasingly difficult as every day passes and the situation gets even more complex. That, I must say, is a very different situation to people who are opposed to a two-state solution. And there are people on both sides of the political spectrum who are opposed to it. On the far right of Israeli thinking, including one of the parties who is now going to be in the new coalition government, the Beit Yehudi party of Minister Bennett, they're against two states because they never agreed with Oslo in the first place. They think there should never be a Palestinian state and there should always be Israeli Jewish control of all the region. They're still a minority, but they have significant support, particularly amongst the settler movement. On the far left, you have others who oppose a two-state solution, but for a completely different reason. They oppose it because they think in the world of post-nationalism, we should be having a single, binational, secular state, which is neither a Jewish state and neither an Arab or Muslim state. Secular, democratic, between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean, everybody is equal there. And we'll have a democracy, everybody will care for each other. That's right. We'll have a single democracy there. They are ideological positions. That's very different to the position, and they're minority positions as well, and they're ideological positions. They have one thing in common. Neither of them require the drawing of borders, which you could say is why I oppose those solutions, because it would do me out of business. But that is very different to the situation today, where there are people who do promote two-state solutions as the best of all the bad solutions, but say we're getting to the point where you just can't do it anymore. It's become so complex to draw the line, it's become so complex to exchange territories, that maybe the answer is to think of something beyond the territorial box, where you do have two different systems of power, but where the actual territory doesn't have lines running through it. And as I say, that sounds very fictional at the moment, but you know what? 10, 15 years ago, the idea of land exchanges sounded fictional, and there's been a tremendous amount of development of thinking in terms of land exchanges. What unfortunately often happens in the Israel-Palestine arena is the fact that often we come up with solutions 5 years too late. And often had we put forward the solution of land exchanges or two states 5, 6 years earlier, when the other side would have been more receptive, then maybe there would have been a greater chance of them being implemented. But we tend to wait too late, and we tend to offer solutions as responses to situations that emerge in the field, rather than taking the situation forward, moving beyond the developing situation and moving in front rather than behind. But as you're all very well aware, because I'm sure you follow the news, the Israel-Palestine conflict is not very close to being resolved at the moment. The new government that has been voted in Israel, which hasn't yet formed its final government, and also Abu Mazen, Netanyahu, Abu Mazen, they're not really speaking to each other. They don't really have much to offer to each other at the moment. We don't see, and I say this on a personal level, unfortunately, we don't see a return to bilateral negotiations. But what we do see is that if you look at the issue of borders, or you look at any of the other issues which are on the table, there is a great detail of knowledge there that wasn't there 20 years ago at the time of Oslo. We know a great deal about what are the considerations for drawing borders, what are the compromises that have to be made, what are the topographical features and the settlement features, what are the factors there? And many of us are walking around with USBs in our pockets where we could just plug them into a computer and literally home in on every 100 square meters of the green line or of the border and show you what is the significance if we move the border 20 meters this way or 10 meters that way. So it's not a lack of knowledge which is there today. The geographers and the cartographers and the political scientists have done their bit, and it's now back to the politicians to try and start regaining the very minimal trust that is lacking, so that a lot of this knowledge can be put into practice. And therefore, the final point I want to make is to say, you know, there aren't many cases out there in the world today where we are really practically engaged in drawing borders. And as a border scholar, this may be the reason I've become a border scholar, but as a border scholar, I actually live 2 kilometers away from one of the few active laboratories where we're still trying to draw land boundaries as a means to determine the final sovereign territories of neighboring countries. Thank you.
Let's have questions. It's extraordinarily stimulating and informative. Very, very lucky to have this overview of borders in the Middle East. But let's questions first.
We'll bring them over there, yeah.
I think I'm going to try to pass this up so that you'll get heard on that.